Really appreciate everybody coming out today for this super session on government. Why don't we start by giving yourselves a great round of applause and the panelists, because really the first step in this new industry is getting engaged and getting out here, and that's what you folks are doing. So let's give a big round of applause seriously for you guys coming out, Cannabis-Aid, our panelists. This is wonderful. It's the first step. And today I'll be your monitor, or your panel moderator, rather. And for those of you that don't know me, my name's Justin Danaskis, and I'm with a multi-client government affairs lobbying consulting organization that my father founded some 20 years ago. And we do work at the federal, state, and local level. And we were integrally involved in the process for the drafting and actual passage of the Michigan Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, and continue work on the companion bills and helping industry and folks of all sides they navigate through those waters. And I have the privilege to work in these folks in Lansing and many others as we develop the policy. And so you're really in a treat today because we have an all-star cast of panelists that I'll introduce in just a second that's going to give you some perspective and insight from their unique vantage points as they're making the laws, amending the laws, implementing them, developing local policy. On the judicial side, what powers does the top cop, our next potential attorney general, have in this matter, and so forth. So you folks are really going to gain some really good insight from their vantage points as you navigate with that partner that we all have, the government, and cut through that red tape. So without further ado, I'll just briefly kind of introduce our all-star cast of panelists today. And so I'll just give the brief kind of tidbits on each of them, and then I'll turn it over to them to just give a 1 minute kind of interesting factoid about themselves or about cannabis. And so as we look at our wonderful panelists today, first we have our great state representative, Fred Durhal, who hails from Detroit. He represents the 5th District, which is eastern part of Wayne County and also southwest Detroit. The representative is in his second term, and he sits on the Appropriations Chair as well as the House Fiscal Agency Chair, and he's very involved in the district as well. So you also hear from him from the district perspective today. So Fred Durhal, anything to add? Did I miss out on any of the highlights or anything you want to share? Just kick us off.
Well, I just want to thank you first for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here today. Just a little interesting history fact why I'm so close to the issue. My father, who's my predecessor in the legislature, was appointed as the chair of the Medicinal Marijuana Task Force prior to the law being adopted. And so I had the opportunity and the pleasure to meet many individuals who are involved within the medicinal marijuana community and the cannabis community. And I learned a lot about it that I did not know. And it was just very interesting to see a 67-year-old man who knew nothing about marijuana be the chair of that task force. So just again, glad to be here with you all today, and look forward to a great discussion.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Our next panelist is Representative Tim Greimel. Representative Greimel hails from the 29th District, so that's kind of northern Oakland County, Auburn Hills, Pontiac, Orchard Lake Village, Sullivan Lake, that area. The representative was actually the leader of his caucus in the House for his first and second term. He was the minority leader in the House. He's very active in Oakland County on various facets in his private sector life. He also serves as an attorney, helping out in the labor, civil rights arena. Representative Greimel also serves on a number of important committees and a lot that cannabis policy go through, as a lot of the cannabis policy goes through the Judiciary Committee, which he serves on, as well as Commerce and Trade, and Insurance, which is kind of rearing its head in this space. With that, Representative Greimel, anything to add as we get warmed up here?
Well, thanks for having me, Justin, and thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you. Thanks for your interest in the panel. It's really great to be here today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Next, we have Representative Patrick Green. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Tedder couldn't come. His wife had a little surgery. And where we got Patrick's slide somewhere. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Representative Patrick Green hails from Warren, and he represents the 28th District, which is centerline in a portion of Warren. And the representative has a very unique vantage point as he served, I think, 8 years or plus on the Warren City Council as well as their Planning Commission. So you'll get to see his perspective, not only how he carried from what he did at the local level from Warren into the State House, so you get a good perspective as he's got kind of fresh lenses from recently being on that council 2 years ago. And also in his private sector, he serves in the insurance field with his own private practice, and he's helping this industry also in the private sector with his insurance side of things. And he also serves on some amazing committees, energy policy, which will start reeling its head here, as well as local government. Representative
Justin,
Green, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It is a unique perspective. I spent 7 years on zoning board, not planning, but and then 9 years on Warren City Council, and I was involved in the initial drafting of the ordinance that's now in place in Warren. It's taken a lot of different turns in that city, but also amongst everyone here that's active in the state. And the perspective I want to add to it is now you're all beginning to interact with your local municipalities and how that happens with zoning and who you need to talk to and who you need to be friends with and learn how to operate with all of those new ordinances that are put in place.
Yeah. Certainly. Thank you. And next we have our potential next top cop, Dana Nessel, who's running for our Attorney General position. Dana is an attorney by trade in the private sector, who you've probably seen her names in numerous headlines for the various cases and things she's done through her illustrious career back when she was at Wayne County in the prosecutor's office. Also her work in the private sector as a tireless advocate for civil rights and amongst other topics. You've heard a lot about her in the over this campaign process, and we're very fortunate to have Dana here. She's most likely going to be our next top cop, and she has a very unique role that we'll talk about should she claim that position as we move forward. Anything to add? And thank you so much for joining us, Dana.
I'm just really happy to be here, you know, one of the things that I've talked about during the course of the campaign is I spent about half my career prosecuting many cannabis-related cases and the other half defending them, and also handling a lot of civil asset forfeiture matters. Grew quickly to see that the war on marijuana was an abject failure, and one of the reasons why I wanted to run for Attorney General is because I strongly support legalization of recreational marijuana. I believe it's going to pass next week, and I want to make certain that we have an Attorney General that is fairly implementing the law, and unlike the man who will be my predecessor, not trying to undermine the will of the people.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Look forward to having that position. Wonderful. Don't forget to get out there and vote, folks. And last but certainly not least, to round out our panel, we have Andy Lecricchio. He is from Hazel Park, and he serves on their city council. And Andy has served on the council for almost, I believe, 10 years plus, since 2001, actually. And he's also very active in the Michigan Municipal League on behalf of the city, as well as on his own vacard, chairing a number of different committees. And I got to commend Andy and the team over at Hazel Park, as they've actually adopted an opt-in ordinance for the Michigan Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, and they're one of only 3 communities throughout all of Oakland County that has done so. So hats off to you and the team over there, Andy, and anything to add from your perspective before we jump into it?
Thank you for having me here, Justin. The medical marijuana, the marijuana movement, drug reform issue has been something I've contributed to for decades, you know, with Marijuana Policy Project, the Drug Policy Alliance, and the whole petition drive. It's been something I see in Hazel Park that is going to help economic development, but from our perspective, we want to make sure it's implemented in a way that doesn't disturb the communities and that the players are part of the community.
Wonderful, wonderful said. And so as you'll see now, and to get a kind of background, a flavor of who the panelists are, this all-star cast is really going to give you a well-rounded perspective from, again, the folks that are writing the laws, amending the laws at the state, those enforcing, interpreting it from our top attorney general position, what's happening in the local space, and so forth. So my job here is to guide them through some leading questions so we can gain some of that perspective and insight, and then I'll try to leave some time at the end so we can hear from your folks as well. So if you have thoughts, questions that come up along the way, jot them down. We'll try to leave as much time at the end for you folks to also answer questions. And then we probably will go a little after the 3 o'clock mark since we started so late. And but Dana does have to run to another event. As you can imagine, she's very busy. So if you see her scoot out at 3, then you know why. So with that, we're going to try to cover a broad range of topics today, and we'll kind of switch it up first and before we get down to the local and some other things. But what about banking? So, we see a lot of green around here, I guess pun intended and so forth, and there's a lot of cash that gets into this industry. And so from your perspectives, what could we do at the state level in absence of federal policy to get some traction and get some of the cash, out of the system and into some of the banks? Could we possibly leverage some of the state credit unions, or what are some thoughts along that way that we could try to get some of the cash out of it as the system evolves? Anyone want to start us off and thoughts about how we can do on the banking side? Sure, Representative.
Thank you. One of the committees I sit on in Lansing is the Finance Committee, and we've had several conversations about this, both with the banking industry and the credit union industry. We've had other organizations come in from Washington State and Colorado State to talk about a PayPal type model, but no matter how much controls we talk about that are in place, the banks and credit unions, from the last conversation that we had, were still concerned about their federal charters and being able to accept the money and still be worried about the federal government coming in and seizing the funds. So there's conversation, yes, we understand, but the banks still, from the last conversation, still don't want to move. Whether that's changed in the last month, I'm not sure.
Right, yeah. As it continues to evolve, there is some shining hope, and there's, a number of banks, credit unions out there servicing the industry, but there's certainly few and far in between, and we got a long ways to go. So we'll be certainly looking upon that. Yes.
Sorry, and I believe that there was a bill dropped by Representative Yanez about starting a state bank.
Correct. Yep, that's one of the things that was looked at.
But I don't know where it stands at this point.
Yeah, excellent. So they are working on some different solutions there from the state side, as you can see, and maybe credit unions, these smaller regional banks, may be your quickest opportunity in conjunction with maybe one of those other financial vehicles that are out there. Now, as we look at Proposal 1, which is looming and looking for passage, and so as we look at the transition, do you feel that these facilities, should recreational become legal and we have new state licensed facilities for recreational, should those be co-located and essentially kind of morphed in with the medical marijuana facilities that are just now starting to get off the ground? We've seen in Colorado where they kind of co-locate them but have two separate drawers and so forth. With the advent of point of sales and so forth, should we leave it to the computers and have one store and one sign the supply, or do these facilities for medical have to be separate from recreational? Start with Andy here on the local side.
That is a great concern. I mean, I've talked with the representatives in the Michigan Municipal League advocating for us. It makes no sense that we'd have the MMFLA people operating a dispensary here and then the recreational operating another business license. It's going to be pretty tricky to implement the way it seems set up. Somebody's going to have to really do something in the next year once it passes, and then they have their year to promulgate laws and rules. But I think it should be one location, different taxing or a different rate structure or a different drawer, however. But it's going to be a problem if we have to put other locations in.
Certainly, especially for a community that's Hazel Park, a smaller bedroom community, fully built out. Where do you fit these extra facilities? Right. Certainly. What about from the legislature's perspective? With lame duck coming up, do we think that we'll get 3/4 majority and have some changes to either the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act or Proposal 1 should it pass? For those in the audience, since the legislature didn't act, is once the signatures in the language is brought forth to them, it will now take 3/4 majority in both chambers to get policy to amend it. So why don't we start with Representative Grimel, being the former House Minority Leader. You did a great job, and the caucus was normally pretty uniform, but maybe not 100% all the time on cannabis policy, but you did a nice job. So what do you foresee for lame duck? Do you see any changes coming or amendments?
Well, and I'll speak to your comment first. Generally, the vast majority of us Democrats in the legislature have been pro-legalization. There have been some exceptions to that, but generally we've been very supportive of legalization. I do think that some harmonization between the two is important. That doesn't mean that they have to be exactly the same or that there can't be two different regulatory structures necessarily, but there's got to be at least some rationale to how the two are going to work in conjunction with one another. And so I do think that there are ways that we as the legislature can act, hopefully sooner rather than later, to bring some harmonization to the two. And certainly one option is to amend the recreational law, assuming it passes. And I think all of us in this room understand the importance of legalizing recreational marijuana. But that requires a 3/4 vote, and I think whether or not we can put together a 3/4 majority in the State House will depend on exactly what those proposals are. The other option, of course, would be a simple majority vote to change the medical marijuana law. So that's another option. We'll see how things play out. But I do think that it's important that there be certainty in the regulatory structure, that there be some, as I say, rationalization or harmonization between the two laws, especially so that we allow for economies of scale, so we allow for an efficient industry. Obviously, part of that debate, just like with the banking and financial institution debate, really would help immensely if we could get the federal government to do the right thing and to legalize cannabis at the federal level. I think we've seen with some of Jeff Sessions' earlier back and forth in terms of some of the memos he issued, that the federal government seems much more willing to overlook and tolerate medical marijuana in states than recreational marijuana, although so far it's taken a mostly hands-off approach to both at the state level. But it would be nice to get some greater certainty in terms of where the federal government stands on these issues. Absent that, I think we're going to see some industry players much more willing to get involved on the medical marijuana side than the recreational side, at least when it comes to financial institutions. So that's another area where I think it would be very helpful to have a rational legal framework if the federal government would do the right thing and legalize it.
Certainly. That'd lift a big veil and give us all some clarity and some direction, wouldn't it? In the absence of that, and as we look at another pillar of our system here, switching over to the judicial and kind of criminal side, Dana, from your perspective, what are some of the broad strokes, initially we'll get to some of the specifics, the impact that you foresee legalization, should it pass in November, having on our judicial and criminal justice system? And then also, I guess the second part to that you kind of addressed earlier on, but after the Medical Marijuana Act of 2008, we had quite a long time in folks are kind of fighting tooth and nail to implement and have some of that policy take forth. What would be different under your regime?
Well, I mean, the biggest difference is that, I want to find the best path forward in terms of making certain that, at the business level, Bill Schuette really went after dispensaries. He really went after businesses. He went after not just those that were providers, but he went after patients, And again, I don't want that kind of thing to happen as it pertains to recreational. If I am in office, and I think the best way that I can do that is by firstly having an ombudsman that can work with businesses to make certain that everybody knows what compliance looks like and is given a fair opportunity to become compliant. The first thing that should happen is not that somebody's door is busted down and all their inventory is seized and the door is locked. Like any other legitimate business is how these businesses ought to be treated. Right. And so, I want to make certain that everybody, is given an opportunity to work within the confines of the law. And that way you identify really who the bad actors are, who are intentionally non-compliant. But the good actors are left alone. And my hope, of course, is that these businesses thrive so that we can, get the tax dollars and put them into the roads and the schools and veterans who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and all the other things that Proposal 1 calls for. I just want to make certain that the law is implemented fairly. And I also want to be able to use the hundreds of millions of dollars that are annually wasted, in my opinion, on testing and investigations and prosecutions on marijuana cases, and I want to use it on things like, cold case homicides, and testing rape kits and things that I think are a little bit more important.
Wonderful. Kind of a follow-up kind of in that same vein if we look at employers. So should Proposal 1 be successful, will an employer, and maybe for your private sector attorney hats as well, will an employer have the right to terminate an employee for medical use or be it adult use should this come through? And is there anything from a state's perspective that we can do to kind of protect those individuals who may use it for medical or recreational purposes? Either Tim from your private sector and or Dana?
Well, certainly the passage of the recreational proposal alone will not prevent employers from firing employees because of marijuana usage. Employers under state law and federal law have the legal authority to fire employees if they use tobacco. They have the authority to fire employees if they use alcohol, and they'll have the legal authority to fire employees if they use marijuana. Obviously, state legislatures can change that, but whether or not there'll be an appetite in the legislature to do so has yet to be seen. I think if we continue to see the existing party and majority in the legislature, they've typically taken a very hands-off approach when it comes to regulating employers and employer conduct towards employees, and I don't think we'll see that change. If Democrats are in control of the legislature, they may take a different view on it. There are, I think, some at least maybe creative or innovative legal approaches to all of those things that could argue that some of this usage might be protected under laws that protect disabled employees and things like that. But the sort of simplest reading of the law, absent those kinds of creative legal theories, is that employers can fire employees for using marijuana, for using tobacco, for using alcohol.
Well, if you mind me chiming
Yes,
in on
wonderful.
this, I think that we're going to get to a place where there's going to be no one left to hire if you're going to fire somebody just based on it. I mean, if you're really treating marijuana like alcohol, what if you fired everyone who used alcohol? You would literally have no employee base. So what I'm hopeful for...
That's a red alert. I'm with you.
It's the Russians, yeah. What I'm hopeful for is that, what I'm saying is, if necessity is the mother of invention, then I think that we're going to make great strides in terms of testing procedures. And I know they're making great strides in saliva tests right now. There's a pilot program underway in other states. They're making progress in their labs. And if we can come up with a saliva-based testing device that can actually test not whether a person has consumed in the last day or the last week or even the last month, but really within the last couple hours, and that's what they're trying to do right now, I think it's going to be useful not just from a law enforcement perspective when you're talking about operating under the influence, but also for employers. And that way, employers will be able to know. I mean, obviously, no one wants somebody who's using either, marijuana or alcohol or really a number of other, prescription medications while they're at the workplace. But if we know that we can come up with a procedure to properly test that, then hopefully, for both employers and again for law enforcement, people will be able to legally utilize marijuana, either again medicinally or recreationally, and not have to worry about losing their jobs and not have to worry about being arrested.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We can hope for
Another
that.
aspect
Yes.
that needs to be defined on too in the employment-related practices liability area is what if it's not smoked, if it's an edible, and it still shows up in someone's system a week later when they go in for a drug test. That's not defined in the statute, but also the workers' compensation. If they get first thing someone gets injured, they get drug tested. How is workers' compensation going to respond to that? It's not defined yet, and we're going to have some people saying it's fine, some not, and it'll get tested in the courts and defined by the courts eventually.
Yes.
Well, I just wanted to add to Dana's comment. I think Dana's absolutely right about the importance of developing these testing procedures. And just because employers have the legal authority or the legal ability to fire people for using any of these substances doesn't mean that they have been doing that. Obviously, they haven't typically been doing that in the context of alcohol or tobacco or even marijuana. And that's because of the pressures of the labor market. Employers want the best and brightest, and they don't want to create an atmosphere where they're firing good employees because of this. I think where the rubber really has hit the road in this area, to Dana's point, is in jobs where it's dangerous to be drunk on the job or high on the job, construction being one example, or a bus driver to use another example. And the testing procedures that Dana rightly says are quickly evolving and need to evolve a little further, I think, to really hit the nail on the head. Once those really are where they need to be to determine whether somebody is high at a particular point in time and not whether they've just used marijuana in the past month, then employers will be better able to actually determine whether there's a safety hazard or not.
Wonderful. Yes. Andy.
I think the subject should turn to impairment versus, having something in your system.
Right.
the real impaired.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. We need that real
That
true
word.
test and something so we can set that if they're impaired versus have something in their system that may not be affecting their cognitive motor skills and so forth. Couldn't
Exactly.
agree more. In the state legislature, these folks all sponsored or supported rather, I believe one may have sponsored the bill.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. We need that real
That
true
word.
test and something so we can set that if they're impaired versus have something in their system that may not be affecting their cognitive motor skills and so forth. Couldn't
Exactly.
agree more. In the state legislature, these folks all sponsored or supported rather, I believe one may have sponsored the bill, setting up a task force to really hopefully get down to is there a proper test in science. I believe they just kind of appointed the folks there. I don't think the task force has done a whole lot yet. The policy was passed last year, but I think they're just starting to get off the ground. So maybe some hope to come and more for the elected officials too to follow up on as it goes down. Kind of keeping the same vein of employer and exposure. What about the insurance side of things? Maybe start with Representative Green, since you have experience both in the public and private sector. The state statute for the MMFLA, I believe, only calls for $100,000 product liability, if I
Correct.
recall. What are you seeing out there? Do we need more legislative action to require maybe a higher threshold or other coverage to make sure these facilities have enough coverage in the patients? And or what advice would you have for those in the private sectors that are looking for, coverage, things they should be aware of?
Well, it's not as difficult as people are making it out to be right now. Most of the insurance companies are using the same application, whether it be Conifer is a known name, and there's several others as well. But one of the more difficult areas to get, the general liability and the product liability you're required to have for your permit with the local municipality. But the building insurance, if there's a mortgagee on there, it's very difficult right now to find a good rate on a building. And that aspect of it has become much more difficult. And then the equipment, and then the lights, and then the backup power. But all the inside the application that you're completing, and be wary of this when you're filling out an application for insurance for this type of operation. If it says it's a warranty application means that every single answer that you put on there is absolute. If they find one aspect of it being incorrect at time of claim, they will deny the claim. So make sure that you have everything read, reread, and a copy of it if anything were to ever happen. That's the most dangerous part of it. To your point about the limits on product liability, $100,000 is a very low dollar amount. Most standards start out at $1 million. And your pricing between $100,000 and $1 million is not significantly more. Minimum premium right now that we do, I just did 3 of them today, and it was $1,000 for product liability for a year. It's not that bad at all. But again, the most dangerous thing and the most difficult thing for new business owners to understand is a warranty application. Be very wary of that.
Wonderful. Great advice and something to look out for, especially as these market is still evolving. You may have heard of some horror stories out of California with regards to product liability issues and product getting in the system, potentially making folks sick and different lawsuits and so forth. So very critical on all aspects that, sure, the state and local are going to have requirements and benchmarks, but it's imperative that you do your homework, dig in, get the right professionals, get the right coverage you're going to need for that business, and then maybe in the future something more for the elected officials and so forth to make sure that there is the appropriate amount of coverage for the patients and companies out there. Maybe there needs to be a bigger statutory set forth. Now, the good news is, as we're wading into these waters of adult use potentially here in just over a week, we can look to a number of other states, of course, right, that have adopted it. And we have some great shining examples, as well as we have some things where the markets may not be as robust and as rosy for the industry as folks may hope. Maybe pick on Oregon initially. From your perspective, is there things we can do to ensure that the system we're setting up in Michigan, be it the medical and as we transition to adult use, that we set up a system that harbors, good business, but doesn't set up a model where it's oversaturated, no one makes any money? Because in Oregon, there is a huge oversupply. So I guess 2-point question there. As you look at other recreational states and so forth, any big things that you've seen or believe in, or then more specifically to my question, as we look at potential oversupply, should there be caps on the number of any certain licenses as we look at as we roll out maybe retroactively in the medical side, should there be caps or enhancements on the recreational side so we don't possibly run into an Oregon scenario?
Well,
President Durham?
I think that definitely depends on the area, city or municipality. So for instance, let's say particularly Detroit, when the medicinal marijuana facilities started coming into Detroit, there was a concern of the proliferation of many of them. If you roll down 8 Mile, it seems like it's the mecca for medicinal marijuana facilities here in the city. I think that competition is a good thing, but I don't think that you don't want to oversaturate the market. I think that is a concern. But a lot of that has to do with how things are regulated based on local cities and municipalities and their ordinances and zoning. Definitely.
Very true.
Where folks will be able to operate those facilities, and to I almost said Attorney General Nessel, but
Hold that for another week.
that absolutely. To her point, we've got to find a way to identify who are the good actors, who are the bad actors, and I think that will bring down the saturation. But you don't want to get too much and over-regulated as well. Because you don't want to create barriers where folks are not able to operate these businesses.
Very well said, certainly. As most folks are aware of it in the proposal, folks can also grow out their home, right? Adult can grow up to 12 plants, per premise and so forth. So it's not like there's other options and avenues as well. So we really have to look at that risk. Yeah, Representative Graham, something to add to it?
Well, just to add to Fred, obviously allowing local municipalities to engage in zoning and appropriate regulatory oversight in terms of where to locate facilities, that's I think very important. I think has broad consensus, at least in the political space, where people think local governments should have authority to do that, just as they do when it comes to zoning over other businesses. I think there's a balance there in terms of giving them too much power or too little power. But I take your question to really be about whether there should be a limit statewide on the total number of licenses. And, I think it's a balance because on the one hand, I think those who are more libertarian in outlook when it comes to economics would argue that, hey, you should let the market determine supply and demand. And if you want maximum efficiency in the marketplace, you want the lowest price, that's the way to do it, to allow the market to determine that. On the other hand, I think there is a risk of oversupply in that would increase incentives for folks to funnel some of the product to states where it's still illegal. And that creates a lot of both interstate law enforcement problems as well as problems in the neighboring states who may still have it be illegal. So I do think there's a legitimate policy interest in trying to prevent oversupply.
Excellent. And maybe that's something that lands on Dana's plate as well. In the proposal one, the way it's written, you can only have interest in up to 5 grows for the first up until the end of 2023. Then the department may promulgate rules to allow more. But they also allow stacking. So could you have, it's left to interpretation, I guess, if you have a 1 grow over here and I stack 5 licenses, can I stack at 5 different locations to do it 5 times to really get me 25? Or was that intent back to, just allowing up to those 5 holistically until the end of 2023? We're going to see a lot of those different things, but you say pretty clear, going to be pretty hands-on in the space as we move forward. But given there's already a lot of confusion, it seems, between local municipalities too, is this a forced opt-in the way the proposal is written? Some believe that communities actually have to proactively opt out, or folks could come and open facilities. Working with the drafters and so forth, I believe the intent was no, just like it is for the MMFLA. Essentially, everyone's opted out because of the lack thereof local ordinances. But two big things that certainly could be litigated and so forth. So I guess lots to come down the pipe and lots of unknowns still. As we look at other states and areas to learn from and so forth, let's look at the taxation. Do you feel that local units of government should be able to levy their own taxes, be it on possibly the gross retail receipts? No taxation without representation, of course, but they could still have their local elections to place the tax. As we look at California, there's 80 different referendums right now, and a lot of them around extra taxes. So do you feel that the locals should have the power to levy, be it a wholesale tax, an extra sales tax on, be it recreational, adult use, or I guess medical? Maybe start with Andy from your local perspective. That's something that intrigues you, or you also had the wonderful horse track there in Hazel Park that just finally closed up. But kind of from your perspective.
The taxing ability of cities is really limited in the state of Michigan. So the structure under the MMFLA was more beneficial than what's under the decriminal, the legalization recreational part. So implementing our own tax, I don't know, it's interesting. Would that have to be passed by the legislative body, or would that go to the citizens, or both? Or it'd be interesting, but I'd like to see how the revenue shakes out as it is. I mean, maybe just allow the cities to keep more than what the state's taking from us. How about that?
There you go. Always got to be fighting for the locals. That's great. Excellent. Because we do run the risk, like the District of Columbia, they have a 25%, I believe, tax on inventory. So before you even open the doors, you're paying 25% tax on your inventory. So also, as we look at potential oversaturation, or if taxation comes in, what can we do to make sure that the black market isn't more lucrative than this new regulated market if we overregulate, and now you go in the store and it's 3 times the price that you may get it off of Craigslist? Thoughts on how to balance that, Representative Greimel?
Well, you read my mind in terms of your comment. I mean, from a harm reduction perspective, one of the big benefits of legalizing marijuana is to stop the black market trade in marijuana and all of the violence and other things that come with simply the illegality of a trade in anything. And if you overtax marijuana, then you'll be opening the door to an illegal trade to avoid those taxes. So I think that's a really important point. There's certainly an argument that just as we don't tax normal prescription drugs in the state, if people are truly using marijuana for a medicinal purpose, that they shouldn't be taxed on that usage either. But I am not a big fan in allowing individual municipalities to tax products in terms of use and sales taxes in general, and I'd be very reluctant to go along with any plan in that regard for marijuana.
Excellent.
And to add to Representative Greimel again, I think that goes back to how we talk about what the market would look like. You'd have different cities and municipalities who have maybe different needs financially or structurally that may want to use that tax or tax at a higher rate than other cities and municipalities. And so I think that if there is a tax, it should be uniform, maybe statewide, and not allow cities and municipalities, and I know right now my mirror would probably go crazy if I say that. However, I don't want to just overtax it, but again, overregulate it, because that black market aspect will come into play. Folks will find a way to sell it cheaper than what it costs on that level, on a legal level, should I say. And then that black market again gets created, and then you have the criminal aspects that come into it. So I think that, we all look at it, particularly from a governing perspective, and I'm one of the head folks on our House Appropriations Committee. We look at it as a way to generate revenue, but I think that we've got to be very careful how we do that, and then find avenues with, in regards to this revenue, to his perspective, that we can get this money back down to our localities, our cities and municipalities, to help them with their structural things that they have to do, and also help the state as a whole. So I always, we had the discussion about Colorado earlier, which I think, is a great model to look at in some aspects, where something that intrigued me was they created a college scholarship that allows kids to go to school or go to college. things like that will be helpful and good for taxation, but allowing cities and municipalities to dictate their own tax structure kind of creates kind of a chaos, so to speak, around the state.
And then from your folks' vantage point, there's a lot of press regarding is the 10% tax on the sale of marijuana is the only tax placed currently under Proposal 1. Is that enough? Yeah, the opposition seems to want to beat up and say, oh, that's the lowest in the nation, and there's no wholesale tax and so forth. What are your thoughts on the 10% tax is set, or maybe the allocation of that 10% as 15% will go to the local municipalities that opt in, 15% revenue sharing to the counties, 35% I think to school aid, or 30, and then 35% to the roads. So do we think the allocation is appropriate, and or the 10% is appropriate, contrary to what some are saying in the news?
I think the allocations pretty much are appropriate. I remember when the bill came through, we had a very serious discussion based on the needs of what the state is. Of course, infrastructure is a huge issue here in our state. That's the pot for potholes argument that we always have. Of course, the educational component is huge. I would like to see folks talk more when we speak about education, talk about substance abuse, talk about dollars that we can put towards that, and that can kind of help alleviate the stigma that's attached to that as well. I think that we have to see what the revenues actually will be generated before we can kind of decide if 10% is enough and 10% is not. I don't think we've had an adequate amount of time to see that work yet, as of yet, and so I think it'd be very premature to say that 10% is not enough at this point. So.
Spoken from a seasoned appropriation member. Let's see the dollars and cents first, and
That's right.
before we spend and see if we need some more. So we always appreciate when we hear those. So as folks are looking to get into the medical space and potentially the adult use space, should it go through next week, Dana, maybe from your perspective, these folks are going to want to advertise their businesses, right? So, if there's disputes and so forth, or as we look at kind of content neutral advertising, what's your perspective maybe from that new position as it relates to kind of advertising and words in the product? And then maybe back down to the locals, how you've, written your local ordinance to exclude certain words and or the advertising, how it may come through the Senate. So anything kind of from the other branch, though, should things be litigated or enforcement on more of the signage and advertising side?
Right. Well, I know that there, have been issues that I think are even First Amendment related issues in regard to that, and I know there's been a lot of controversy in regard to. Much of it seems very silly to me. I just can't believe that you're not allowed to advertise what kind of products you sell in the store that you have open. But I think that from the law enforcement perspective, obviously we'll be enforcing whatever the law is, keeping in mind those First Amendment issues that I think you always have to be mindful of constitutional issues in regard to enforcing any law. But that'll be something that the legislature is going to have to deal with, and they're going to have to make what I hope are the right decisions. And again, I think that is part and parcel of making certain that you have the right people in these legislative positions, whether it's the governor's office or in the state house or senate, that are not so anti-marijuana, not so anti-cannabis, that they're being irrational in the way that they're structuring these laws, which I think is what we've seen up until this point in many, up until recently, I'd say. You weren't seeing people that wanted to work in a fashion that they were making it easier for people. They were making it harder for people to engage in what was a legal business.
Exactly, and if we want folks to transition and they want to get folks in the regulated market that want to commercially operate, well, we can't shoestring them. We got to make sure they're able to be successful in those spaces. So well said. Continuing on that, there was a couple of bills that were trying to work their way through the House with regards, and the Senate. They were double bluebacks. If you recall, when Weed Maps put up some various signs that said "Hi Lansing" or "Hi Detroit," Senator Jones and now Mayor, former Representative Andy Ashore weren't too happy about those. Those bills really haven't got much traction or gone anywhere, but from should cannabis be regulated like alcohol or tobacco, or how should we, from a legislative standpoint, regulate the advertising in the space? Representative Grime, want to take a stab first?
Well, you know, the government certainly has an ability under the First Amendment, and courts have consistently held this. The government has a greater ability to regulate commercial speech than political speech. However, there are constitutional limits on how much government can regulate even commercial speech. I think it's important, if we want the industry again to operate efficiently and according to the rules of the market, it's important that we allow for free communication. Otherwise, businesses have no means to differentiate themselves based on quality or based on price. And so I think you want to allow the free facilitation of basic information in the marketplace. But again, it's like so many things in government, it's a balance. Certainly, government should be able to regulate the placement of billboards, the size of billboards, things like that can amount to a public nuisance. And I think just as there are mandatory disclosures in the case of tobacco, to the extent that there are established medical risks associated with marijuana, it's okay to require some disclosures along those lines. So I don't think it's an all or nothing approach. I think it's a balance, and that's true in a lot of areas of public policy when it comes to responsible governing.
Excellent. And Andy, from a local perspective, we'll circle
Sorry.
back to, Representative Green.
Real quick, from the local level too, on zoning, they're going to deal with any signage issues that you have. If you want to put up a sign, you're going to be limited in to a certain number of square feet on the building itself. You're going to be limited to if there's a pole sign existing to how far it's set back from the front yard setback. Any other signage outside the building is what the cities can regulate. Inside windows, inside the building is not regulated. That's up to you. Some cities have taken it a bit further and said, well, only 30% of your windows can be covered with advertising. For, think of the local party store that has this week's special on every single window. You cannot see in. And they've said it's a public safety issue, and they've made it part of their zoning, and they defended it. So when you do open up a retail space, and you do look at a sign package from a sign company, make sure that they have a good relationship with their local building department and their zoning inspector, and that you don't need to go for a variance, because I will tell you that your operations going in front of a zoning board asking for a variance is going to be very difficult, because no one's going to want to be the first city to vary on the ordinance that's just been written.
Exactly. Yep. Andy, from the local perspective, I know the Hazel Park had excluded a couple of specific words that they didn't fit within the fabric of Hazel Park, and kind of piggybacking, I think, Representative Grimal's earlier comments, I think it is very crucial that you have that local planning and zoning and local ordinance oversight so that works for the fabric of your community really fits. So as you guys were looking, I know you excluded a couple of words, but how has it affected, or what are your thoughts on the advertisement, and then we'll kind of transition to other local stuff?
I didn't personally have a problem with the green crosses, but that didn't make it into the legislation and the ordinance. We are requiring signage, but we aren't allowing advertising outside of that. There are some billboards in our city, so I don't know what that might happen if there's advertising like that. That'd be up to the individuals. I agree it becomes a First Amendment freedom of speech issue, and it'll be interesting to see, because we, as a city, we are only allowed to regulate, the size, and we have to treat all our signage the same. We aren't allowed to do the content so much, except
Right.
this ordinance and the state law does give us some leeway, and I thought there was some language in there in the state rules about advertising.
Yeah, there is some rules on advertising. We're still operating under the emergency rules, so there's been some tweaks in the permanent rules. We'll kind of bring that back. It's very interesting that the emergency rules sunset on November 15th, I believe, and we need the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations to adopt the permanent rules. But as it's campaign season and elsewhere, when we look at the legislative session, there may be a gap there in actual on the coverage of rules. Now, you're only supposed to allow to extend the emergency rules twice, which has been done. So there will be a lot of work to do during the lame duck season, certainly, and lots to get accomplished. And we're going to continue. We'll keep rolling through, but it's getting close to 3, so I'll ask one more question of Dana. We'll let her scoot out. She has another event to go to. Lastly, from your perspective, the proposal one does enhance a lot of consumer rights and so forth. What other things from your perspective need to be enhanced as we look at, patients' rights, adult use, maybe at the, protections for consumption and otherwise, as you kind of get your mind shifting into your new role, as Attorney General, perhaps. From your standpoint, what enhancements are done or what more needs to be done to kind of help the patients and or business owners?
Right. Well, actually, one of the bigger concerns that I have is making certain, obviously Proposal 1, unlike some similar proposals in other states, it doesn't address people who are currently under sentence for marijuana-related offenses that will now likely become legal activities. And it does not address how we're going to deal with people who have prior convictions. Right. So one of the things that's of most interest to me is that, the last thing that I'd like to see are people who have convictions for, again, activity that's not going to be legal. And those convictions can really hinder a person, in terms of employment, their ability to seek housing, educational opportunities, the list goes on and on. Yeah. So what I want to do, and I'd like to speak to our future Governor Whitmer in regard to this, and I think she's going to be amenable. And I understand that, I was endorsed very early by MI Legalize, and I saw that she was now as well, which you think about what a long way this industry has come in that you now have the gubernatorial candidate and the AG candidate that are both leading in the polls, who are both endorsed by a pro-recreational legalized, organization. It's something you wouldn't even imagine.
Amazing times, yeah.
But I'd like to, day one that we're both sworn into office, I'd like to have a list ready to go that I can put on her desk, asking her to commute the sentences of people who are in custody. Either they're incarcerated in the Michigan Department of Corrections, in county jails, or they're under probationary sentences. I think they should immediately have their sentences commuted. But moreover, I think we need to take another step further, and this is legislative in nature. I've already talked to members of the state legislature who have proposals ready to go. I just talked to Representative Sheldon Neely from Flint the other day, and he had something that I think we can work together on that would allow to expand the expungement statutes so that it will be easier for people to have these convictions removed from their records, and they'll have an opportunity to do it. And I have another number of ways in which I'd like to see that done to make it as seamless and easy as possible, especially for those who have convictions of simple possession, misdemeanor convictions, which I think those should all be gone. And I can think of some much easier ways to do it. I've handled dozens and dozens of expungements, and I know they can be unwieldy. It can be a difficult system to navigate. It's sometimes you can't afford an attorney. There are things that I'd like to be able to do to make it easier to get these convictions off people's records, so that more people in this state can seek employment and have other opportunities afforded to them for activities that are not going to be completely legal. That is, for me, a priority.
Wonderfully said. Give it up for Dana Netzel, everyone. Your next Attorney General here. Make sure you get out there and vote. Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.
She took it, the words right out of my mouth. Is most of you are probably aware, unfortunately, expungement didn't make it in the final version of Proposal 1. Not to get into all the horse trading and so forth, but you can't get everything in the proposal. You got to be, put the political hat on and look at the political science which you can get done there. And so with that, we'll take about the next 10 minutes. I'm going to ask a couple more questions on some legislative policy, and then we'll open up for you folks that have questions in the audience. So I'll have two more kind of policy questions that may be of some real interest to you folks along the lines of cannabis. The state legislature, through the House, recently passed a package of bills to amend the Industrial Hemp Act. And so, along with CBD, as the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation and the Department of Licensure and Regulatory Affairs read the definition of marijuana in the MMFLA and say, oh, that encompasses hemp and CBD. So all these fine gentlemen did vote for that package of bills. So why don't you give us a little insight as to the importance of, clearly defining in policy and making sure kind of the baby's not thrown out with the bathwater or unintended consequences. And then given we are such a robust farming state, and as it's proposed in this package of bills, it's kind of just a small little licensure fee if you want to get in the hemp and CBD side of it. And this would pull that out of the MMFLA. So if you just want to be in hemp and cannabis, you wouldn't have to go through all the laborsome MMFLA process. So along those lines, you hearing much from some more of the rural districts about the opportunities of hemp, and or talk about just what good policy and unintended consequences when kind of some things get wrapped in there, if you will.
I mean, again, I think the discussion is very exciting to a lot of rural communities right now in regards to industrial hemp. I think folks are, particularly Michigan being an agricultural state, if folks don't know, one of the largest in the nation, I think folks are just very excited, particularly in the rural areas, to be able to get into the industry. I do think there may be some unintended consequences by some of the legislation that may come down. Again, as we speak on regulation and regulating the industry, how that plays out, right now there's some ambiguity to it because we simply just don't know. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, of course, but I'm very excited just to see what the future of industrial hemp would do. I mean, you look at other countries, hemp is being used all around the world to do some great, amazing things. I think Michigan could not only just generate revenue and stabilize itself and create another agricultural field or industry, should I say, here in the state. I think it will help stabilize some of the budgetary pressures that we have here within our state.
Excellent, excellent. And another opportunity that we'll kind of open up to you folks, another potential business opportunity, but may need some legislative action to make possible. Proposal 1 does set up and allow for LARA to set up different regulations for non-home consumption. So we're entering a very exciting times where adult use could, very well, and I believe will be, legal here in Michigan here in just over a week. But do we need to look at some policy for, your social clubs, for special events, drive-throughs, none of these things are explicitly allowed. The door is kind of open for it, but any policy of that or some of these ancillary businesses or circling around the actual consumption, maybe start from Andy's perspective. Do you think that would be, a social club or somewhere someone could sue in Hazel Park be something that could possibly be beneficial? As we've seen some other states, people complain about all the consumption in public, streets perhaps. So what about from a local's perspective?
I don't know why it would be treated so much differently from tobacco use. I mean, I can understand some of it, but you go outside, if you're at the bar, you go outside and have a cigarette. If you're at the Cobo Hall, people go outside and have a cigarette. Sit on your front porch in Hazel Park and you can have a cigarette out there too. The shops and stuff, I don't know, it'd be neat, it's a coffee shop, it's another thing, but I don't know if that's quite a business model that would last. I mean, I could see it being unique, little boutiques and stuff, but I don't know how long that would last, and people are doing it in other areas. The vaporizing pens, people don't even know people are smoking marijuana. So I think there's some opportunity, but I don't know how long it would really last. Okay. I wonder.
From a legislative standpoint, Representative Greimel, anything to add? Or maybe, what about the delivery? And the proposed permanent rules, it would allow a provisioning center employee to go deliver to up to 3 patients. So I think home delivery is a critical piece as we look at how other pharmaceuticals are delivered. Obviously, we look at Amazon, just the nature of our society and going to the more delivery model. Should that be expanded upon? Where on the opposite side in California, I think they can deliver up to $10,000 worth of product on their run. So is there a medium? What do we look at for helping the citizens and so forth?
Well, I think home delivery makes sense as long as the proper safeguards are in place to make sure that the chain of custody is safeguarded and that there are other protections as there are currently under the medical marijuana law in terms of distribution more broadly. But you think of in the context of medical marijuana, people who are using this for medicinal purposes, who may be bedridden or otherwise disabled, who aren't able to easily leave the home. And I think it makes a lot of sense. In terms of the question of how best to regulate marijuana in terms of public use, as was said, I think both tobacco and alcohol regulations provide the appropriate guideposts here. Secondhand smoke, I think, is a valid concern. Just as we don't allow tobacco smoking in restaurants or bars broadly, I don't think we should allow marijuana smoking in those venues broadly. But we do allow specific cigar bars, for example, to operate in the context of tobacco. When it comes to smoking marijuana in public, just as we don't allow, generally speaking, people to be drinking from an open container because of concerns about public intoxication, probably doesn't make sense to allow people to smoke marijuana on a sidewalk. On the other hand, if it's on their porch, it's a different matter.
Certainly. Yes, Representative Durrell.
I think we have to just be very careful though in regards to public consumption and laws or what we legislate in our state. How far does it go? Do we say that a person cannot utilize oils in public because they have it in their pocket and their arm is aching? Do we say that we cannot smoke in public places, but folks are allowed to have chewing tobacco? Are we saying that folks can't consume edibles in public places? And so I think those are some real, concerns that we have to look at in regards to that regulation and understand the nature. And I think when it comes particularly to consumption, I think that some of these harsh regulations come down because of the stigma that is attached. So when you talk about marijuana or legalizing marijuana, the first thing everybody thinks is everybody's going to smoke it in public. And that's not necessarily true. There are a lot of folks who utilize edibles. There are a lot of folks who consume edibles or use oils to fill their medicinal needs or and have that type of relief. So we've got to be very careful on how we define how folks can or utilize this and how consumption is, and make sure that we kind of keep it in the framework maybe of a tobacco or maybe of an alcohol, but understand that it's unique in its own self, and there are different ways that folks use it.
Spoken like a seasoned legislator, devil's in the details, and all too often, unfortunately, the legislative intent isn't always carried out. So the devil's in the details. Very pertinent that we try to get it right as much as possible on the policy side, so when they go to interpret it, that things carry out the right way. With that, we have a few more minutes. If there's any questions, anyone have a question from the audience, raise your hand. I'll come over to you. Is there any questions from the audience that we have? Seeing no big takers, I'll leave it with this, that as you'll see,
there you go.
Got a couple? All right, I'll kind of walk down. Go ahead, if it's a broad one or if you got one for a particular member, go for it.
My name is Jerry Millen. I'm the first licensed provisionary center in Oakland County. We were granted our license last week. Unfortunately, there is no supply from licensed growers or processors in Michigan. So I'm paying for a license, about $6,000 a month, that I won't be able to use for about 4 months. I have to eat that. My application should have been processed sooner than October 18th. The price of the application went up from $48,000 to $66,000. So I just got hit with another $18,000. So almost $40,000, and there's not any product. What I would hope some of our legislators would do is go back to Lansing, when Prop 1 passes, and kick somebody in the butt and say, let's get these rules written. Don't wait 12 months. If you wait 12 months, you think the black market's big now? It's going to be 10 times the size. If they don't write those rules quick, it's going to be everywhere, and you're never going to get the genie back in the bottle. So I suggest please go back to Lansing when this passes and say, these rules need to be written now, not 12 months.
Right.
So thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And these representatives have been leading the way. Actually, Representative Green sponsored a bill to kick the deadline that the department set forth on for the transition, to try to work with the department and say, wait a minute, all these folks like yourselves are going through this laborsome process. Give them some time. Why do we keep drawing these arbitrary lines in the sand? Because I think you hit the nail on the head. There's going to be quite the shortage on these heavily regulated state facilities. From the licensed facilities, yeah. Yep. Couldn't agree more. Another question.
Thanks. My name is Kevin White, and I'm out of Denver, Colorado. And I run a company that focuses on corporate social responsibility in the cannabis space. And I'm curious, I know other states and some municipalities in Colorado have adopted community engagement plans as part of the licensing requirements. Does Michigan do that? Is that anything that's coming up in either state legislation or local municipalities are responsible for creating that when they give? And forgive me, I don't know exactly how Michigan does their licensing, but there are some local municipalities in Colorado that, because everything is done locally, they actually require community engagement as well.
The arrangement here is similar in that there's not any sort of state level requirement, but municipalities, if they choose to opt in under the medical marijuana ordinance, they can also choose to require or at least weigh heavily whether a licensee is engaging in community benefit activity. Now, what's a little unclear to me, frankly, is how Proposal 1 will work, given that there's a question as to whether it's an opt-in mechanism or an opt-out mechanism. Municipalities may or may not, depending on how courts interpret that, have the same ability to impose certain requirements or certain considerations in determining whether or not local licensees are able to operate there under the recreational law.
And I'll speak specifically to Detroit because there always is a lot of discussion about community benefit agreements here, particularly with some of our larger corporations or larger businesses here. I do expect to see that type of push towards some of the facilities that may open in regards to community benefit. And these are just discussions that are floating around when Prop 1 passes. I do expect to see some type of ordinance or maybe requirements maybe coming to fruition that will require certain facilities to operate or, in the community, maybe operate, using maybe substance abuse or, substance abuse classes or whatnot to kind of stop, I guess, children from having type of access to it or children wanting to do that. I mean, these are just discussions that are floating around. But I do expect that type of community benefits, particularly a city as large as Detroit and how the history of community benefit agreements are going right now. I do expect that to come here in the city of Detroit.
Great question, and being in the trenches in the local municipalities too, a number of them that are going through a merit-based system for their scoring form are having points and or plans required for community engagement or what they'll have, and a number of municipalities are weighing heavily on those as they're going through their various vetting processes and so forth. Hazel Park, I know, had a very robust one, and community engagement was certainly a part of that. And with that, our wonderful panel is also very open with their time in their offices. As they're coming down here, being engaged, giving you some insight into where they're coming from, and each and every one of them have wonderful support staff. And so as you're continuing to navigate the waters and you have policy questions, you want to get engaged. That's where it all starts. And so, reach out to them, get engaged. We're entering this lame duck season where some different things can happen. So you always got to be vigilant. And it all starts with the policy, right? And then you folks are out there in the waters navigating them.